My name is Edward Gerard, and I was honored last year to get this award. And I thank you guys every day for it. I just want to say a few things so that we can spend most of the time on Richard. Richard got his Bachelor of Arts at Cal State LA in sociology.
Long Beach. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't realize it was on. Whoops. Go for it, Kendra.
Oh, Long Beach. Long Beach, thank you. Mistake already. He got his master's in sociology from Cal State LA. Then he was hired here in 2001, and I want to list some of his awards that he's gotten since then. Glasses. Richard received from the Scholars Program the 2003 and 2006 Teacher of the Year Award. In 2007, Richard received the Teacher of the Year Award from Alpha Gamma Sigma. In 2008 and 2009, Richard got the Teacher of the Year Award from Associated Students of Glendale Community College. Where's the competition here, Richard? And then in last June, he received this award, Distinguished Faculty Award for 2013. He has served as, now presently serving as Guild President. He has been Guild Vice President, Grievance Officer, and part of the Guild negotiating team. Just a couple of personal things from my point of view. Richard and I have a lot of differences. We have a lot of differences. What I would like to bring out. When he was hired in 2001, I was hired in 1975. What does that say about our ages? Wow. He teaches sociology in the social sciences division. I teach human anatomy in the biology division. My politics, I would say, are somewhere over here. His are somewhere over there. Richard has taught two of my children, Anne-Marie and Matt. I texted Matt this morning. He's in Texas. I said, "You remember Richard Kamei?" And then he said, "Does he have a beard?" And so I sent your picture by way of the Elva Carol. He says, "Such a nice guy." That's what Matt said. I hope I live long enough to be able to teach your children. And at any rate, this is my last. I would like to tell you we do have in common that we both love to teach. And the last thing I'm going to say before Richard comes up here is a quote directly from Richard. "My most favorite things about teaching are when I see students develop a love for learning and when they become aware of the power they possess to make a difference in their lives as well as to make an impact on society." I'd like you to welcome Richard Kamei.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? All right, great. I always have to have my coffee right there. All right. It's my crutch. Well, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Words can't express how honored I am to be the recipient of this prestigious award. And I'm both humbled and blessed to work with so many committed, hardworking, intelligent people that work tirelessly to make a difference in our world, one student at a time. I especially want to thank my parents who are here today, Tadashi and Noriko, my dad and mom. I want to thank them for all their hard work, love, and support. My dad came to the United States in the 1950s with very little, from a war-torn Japan. And he worked hard all his life to provide a better life for his family. And so from him, I learned the values of hard work and integrity. And my mom gave up her professional dance career for the sake of the family. And she left the country she loved to live here in the United States. And so from her, I learned the true meaning of the Japanese saying, "Kodomo no tameni," which basically means for the sake of the kids. And the way I understand that is, it's for the sake of not only our kids, but all kids and the future generation. I also want to thank my beautiful wife, Stacy, for being there for me with all her love and support. She's sitting right there. I mean, she's been extremely supportive of me since we met back in the summer of 1989. And honestly, if it were not for her, I almost am positive I would have never attended a university. And she remembers me back then, so she would probably agree. And there are many other people that I want to thank, and they're just too numerous, and I apologize. I want to just miss people. So instead of doing that, I just want to thank everyone that's been there for me, all throughout my life. Ever since I've been here, since 2001, God, I've had so much support from basically almost everybody that I've met. So I appreciate that. I'm also grateful to the California Community College system because it completely changed my life. And in many ways, it actually saved my life. And therefore, I hope that we stay true to the original master plan, which in its essence is about accessibility and equity. So we must never lose that. I also thank the community colleges for being there for me because I was not the best student growing up. From kindergarten through high school, my parents would probably attest to this, I didn't study. I was too busy doing other things like so many young people. And there's a price to pay for such decisions. So by the time I graduated high school, which really they shouldn't have given me that diploma, I never did any work, hardly any math, no school, no essays. My mom used to ask, don't you have homework? Where's your book? Don't have any work. And so I graduated without doing any real academic work, unfortunately. Although I also wanted to add, there were a lot of vital lessons that I learned, though, along the way. Probably because I was doing things outside of academia, I learned a lot of things outside of book smarts, which I won't get into. When I enrolled in community college, I was just about to turn 21 years old. I learned that I was remedial in math and English. I was not surprised that I was remedial in math because I didn't study math and I didn't study any other academic subject for that matter. But I was shocked that I was remedial in English because I was born and raised in this country and I assumed that was enough, right? But it wasn't. And so I still remember dropping my English class due to false pride. I was like, man, excuse me, man, forget this is what I said. And I was much younger with a lot more attitude than I have now. And I wasn't going to go back. But then, I met my wife. She was my girlfriend at the time. And she said, yeah, college is good. You're halfway smart. And so I told her the night before I was going to take the placement test for English. One more try. Back then, we could do it as many times as we wanted, I think. And so she said, oh, why didn't you tell me earlier? I said, well, I'm just going to take this placement test. I scored really low. What do you think? She goes, well, write something up. And so I wrote up a quick essay. I wish we kept it. And she told me you're missing some things. So she taught me some basic but important lessons. Basically, I needed an introduction, a body, and conclusion. Honestly, I didn't even have that, right? What a concept. So after that, I was able to place into the college level, class for English. I don't know if I really placed there, but that's where they put me. And from then on, a lot of changes came about. I also want to mention that I was about to turn 21 at the time, and I had not read a book from cover to cover since early elementary school. Seriously, I didn't read. It's hard to believe, right? But when I took a sociology class, it completely changed my life. I wanted to learn everything about the discipline of sociology, but since I became engaged, I wanted to learn everything else, and so all the subjects became interesting to me, including math. And so I really developed a love for learning, and I haven't lost that. And I've become a voracious reader, perhaps to my wife's dismay, since I'm often reading late into the night. But I tell her this all the time, I have a lot of years of catching up to do. And so I'd rather not sleep, because I feel like I lost something like 15 years of my life when I was messing around, doing all kinds of other stuff. But again, I learned a lot of stuff there. But not book smart, so I'm still trying to catch up, and I still have some issue about that. And that's probably why I'm on this mission to catch up. Now, deciding on the topic wasn't easy. As people know me, there's a lot of things I'm interested in. I wanted to talk about immigration, and I thought about doing that. There's also race and ethnic relations, the environmental crisis, labor-related issues, corporate crime. There's a bunch of things. But there's one theme that cuts across all of them, and it's my passion for social justice. And since we're busy, we got to focus our attention on a few areas, and one area that I focus my attention on is education. And I know that this is true of many of you. Now, I chose a profession in education not only because I love to learn and I love to teach, but I chose a profession or a career in education because I want to empower the students that entrust me with their education. So that's the main reason why I'm here. There's another reason, which maybe I get to in a few minutes. But needless to say, we as educators, face many challenges. We face challenges from outside the educational system as well as within the educational system. So for my presentation today, I'll focus on the challenges of great levels of wealth and income inequality on our society, especially its negative impact on education. Then I want to discuss how teaching about inequality can hopefully inspire students to become lifelong learners the way I was inspired, and then hopefully, eventually lead to their liberation, right? That's hopefully the goal. And then the liberation of society. I know I'm an idealist, but I believe that this can happen someday. Now, every semester, I point out the facts about wealth and income inequality. And this subject seems to really capture the interest of many of my students. So I'll take a few minutes to discuss some of what I discuss in class, a little bit of it. Now, most people know that inequality exists. It's not a surprise. But people are usually shocked when they learn the degree to which inequality exists in our society today. And inequality has been growing since the mid-1970s. Now, in order to understand our current predicament, an understanding and critique of capitalism is necessary. Now, as Karl Marx said, right, over a century ago, capitalism has inherent contradictions, which lead to greater levels of inequality and crises. The fundamental contradiction that's relevant here is the contradiction between capital and labor. That is, capitalism depends on the constant accumulation of capital or increasing profits to survive. And so in order to do this, they must try to reduce production costs through the use of technology or the exploitation of labor. And the problem with this is that low wages combined with limited markets can lead to a crisis in overproduction. And I think almost everybody understands this. And Karl Marx explained that the capitalist class will use a reserve army of workers to suppress the wages of workers. And so the reserve army of workers have been utilized, or has been utilized, got to get that grammar correct, has been utilized probably ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if not before then. But there are changes that have occurred since the 1970s that have increased the pool of the reserve army of workers. And so deindustrialization was a major factor that led to an increase in the reserve army of workers. Now, when you think of deindustrialization, most people think of Detroit or Flint, Michigan, but Los Angeles was also greatly impacted by deindustrialization. We used to have major automobile plants and tire plants and aerospace manufacturers. How many people remember this? Yeah, okay, great. Check this out. Anyone recognize that? Where's my water again? I'm just... No. It used to be, right, the Uniroyal tire plant. It closed down in 1978, right? But like so many plants all up and down the Alameda corridor and across the nation, they shut down in the 1970s. And so here is what it is today, right? Well, that might be a little bit old, but you guys know what I'm talking about. Technology, better communication, and better transportation allowed for capitalists to conveniently move production overseas and across borders, and it gave them easy access to global workers. So here's, and many jobs, as you know, were outsourced to nations where the workers had little to no labor rights, pay was very low, and working conditions were horrible, right? And dangerous, in fact. And so here's an image of exploitation then, as I wrote. And thank goodness that we don't have this level of exploitation anymore. Do we? Oh, we do? Here we go. Exploitation today. I mean, it shows another fundamental problem. Capitalism doesn't resolve its problems, right? It just moves them to other parts of the world. And it's not to say that we don't have these problems in the United States today, because we know LA is one of the headquarters for sweatshops, right? So it's not completely gone. Of course, man, we got to pay them close to minimum wage, perhaps. And these folks, I don't know how much they get, but you know, it's a lot less. And so here we go. On top of that, the drive for profits oftentimes is at a price. People. Some of you guys remember this. Historians know this, right? And so one of the consequences of profits over people is this. The Triangle Shirt Fire back in 1911, killing 146 workers. Unfortunately, this type of situation occurs constantly. I mean, if you read the news, Bangladesh has had several examples. And here's a more recent one, although there's a couple in 2013. A major fire at one of their garment factories. And here's another one, when the building collapsed. And we know a lot of the major companies, won't name any right now, but you guys know, benefit from this labor. It's not like they don't. And so here's 1,129 people dying from that particular tragedy. So it's hard to imagine. Still going on. Hard to turn a blind eye to it, man, when you realize what's happening. Now, in the US, going back to the United States, we used to have a lot of solid, good union jobs with full benefits, right? Where we didn't have to pay into the premium. Okay. Well, this is changing. It's been changing since the 1970s. I mean, you can see the people struggling for not just better pay. Some of the folks might accept the pay, but they just want full-time jobs, right? They're looking for full-time work. And then others, of course, want a livable wage. And unfortunately, this trend is occurring all across different industries and professions. So here we can see a drop, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the percentage that, full-time work. But of course, as the percentage of jobs that are full-time go down, the percentage of contingency, temporary, and part-time jobs go up. But it's real fortunate that we work in an area where this does not happen, in academia. No, it does, right? Take a look at the top two lines. Now, this isn't perfect, but the top line represents part-time faculty. Numbers are going up, right? The percentage, part-time. The line right underneath it represents full-time tenured faculty. And even at our school, GCC, and other community colleges, I mean, we know, right, the ratio between full-time and part-time faculty. We may have like a couple hundred full-time faculty, but we have hundreds, right, 500, 600 part-time faculty. There's another aspect of the Reserve Army of Workers, something that I think most people understand, so I'll go through quickly. Immigration has also been used to increase the pool of Reserve Army of Workers, and those who study race and ethnic relations understand this very well, right? And the divide and conquer strategy that goes along with it. Now, going back to that crisis that we mentioned just earlier, right? Wages are being suppressed, workers are not making as much money, and so what needs to be done to avoid overproduction, the crisis of overproduction, is that you got to get, open up markets or get the workers that are losing their wages or declining in wages to spend. So billions of dollars has been spent by various companies to entice people, to convince people that their path to happiness is through consumerism. And in order to maintain this particular standard of living, or for many now, just to survive, people have had to work more hours, more family members have had to contribute to the family income, and loans have had to be used. But unfortunately, this situation did not resolve the fundamental contradiction of capitalism. So in order for capitalism to survive, it must continually grow. But that places limits on the system. And so by the 1980s, there were less and less opportunities in real production for capitalists to invest their money. Therefore, new opportunities and instruments had to be created. A great book on this is The Great Financial Crisis, Causes and Consequences by John Bellamy Foster and Fred Magdoff. So financial institutions capitalized on this opportunity, and since workers' wages were depressed, they had no choice but to borrow money, or very little choice but to borrow money. So a powerful credit card industrial complex develops under this, so a lot of people understand. And the housing bubble is also tied to this situation. So as Foster and Magdoff argue, since there are limited opportunities to invest in the stagnating real economy or real production, speculative bubbles fueled by massive debt became the method, right, of survival and growth for advanced capitalist nations. So that's an important piece. Another piece is that to increase the profitability for the capitalist class, they spent billions of dollars, right, trying to influence legislation. So during the Great Depression, laws are passed, the most important probably being the GlassSteagall Act to protect the public. So some of you guys remember this guy. Maybe never met him, but remember, see pictures of him, right? FDR. The GlassSteagall Act is extremely important because what it did is it separated, right? It enforced separation of the commercial banks, which accepted deposits, versus investment banks, which issued securities. And I guess times are good. They learned the lessons of the Depression, some of the problems with the free market. And lo and behold, a few decades passed, a lot of money going into politics, as you see. Oh, you didn't see it. You saw the image earlier. And bam, a significant thing occurred in 1982, right? With Ronald Reagan's signing of the Garn-St. Depository Institutions Act. This thing basically provided more power, right, to financial institutions, and it led to the savings and loan crisis and scandal of the 1980s, as well as the current subprime housing crisis that we lived through about 5 years ago, because it also created the opportunity for adjustable rate mortgages. But the bigger changes, believe it or not, came in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. So in 1999, Bill Clinton signed into law the Financial Services Modernization Act, which basically replaced the GlassSteagall Act. And so now you have a situation where banks and financial institutions can serve as both the commercial bank, investment bank, but to add to that combination, an insurance company. And Slick Willie wasn't done right there, right? There's one other act that he passed. A year later, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And this is important too, because this act guaranteed the legality of new financial instruments. So loans of various types, home loans, student loans, car loans, and commercial loans were bundled, right? And they're referred to as collateralized debt obligations, or you may have heard them as mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, or over-the-counter derivatives. And these new so-called financial instruments were insured by what is referred to as credit default swaps. And AIG, the American Insurance Group, was the #1 insurer of collateralized debt obligations. And massive defaults, of course, on these loans were inevitable because the lenders were not concerned about the borrower's ability to pay it back, because they basically bundled the loans and they sold them off to other parties, and therefore collecting or foreclosing on these borrowers was placed on other parties. So the defaults were inevitable. And when they began, hit the fan, right? And so the value of the collateralized debt obligations plummeted. But companies like Goldman Sachs, I mean, they're happy they had insurance, so they went to AIG, their insurer, to get paid. But guess what? AIG didn't have the money. Another wonderful consequence of deregulation. And as we all know, the government came in and they bailed them out at full value for their monumental mistakes and criminal activities. So whatever happened to free market capitalism, right? I mean, here we go. Taxpayers are, dealing with the brunt of the mistakes that were made. And we, the public, were stuck with an economy in shambles with great levels of inequality. So let's look at wealth inequality. I want to start off with this quick chart. This is a survey by Michael Norton of Harvard Business School and Dan Ariely of Duke University that shows what Americans think is the ideal, that's in the middle, versus what they think is actually occurring at the top, versus what it actually is. So please take a minute to look at this. I know. As you can see, we're not only far from the ideal, we're far away from what most Americans think is actually occurring. Now, if you were to take net worth, which includes net equity in owner-occupied housing, versus financial wealth, which excludes net equity in owner-occupied housing, the disparity is even bigger. But either way, right, the top 1% owns about 40% of the wealth, and the top 10% owns roughly 75 to 80% of the wealth. So the top 1% owns more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. And if you're looking at the bottom 40%, they also don't own much, and they have quite a bit of debt, unfortunately. Now let's look at income inequality. income inequality in the United States is just as skewed. The top 20% earns about 50% of all income, while the bottom 20% earns about 3% of all income. And if you're looking at our purchasing power, you can see how since the 1970s, it's declined quite a bit. Now, since we work in academia, I wanted to use an example from academia. The starting salary for a Cal State University professor in 1968 was about $9,600 gross annual income. Now, how much was a solid, nice, middle-class home in the suburbs, maybe 3-bedroom, 1 or 2 baths, back in 1968? Yeah, oh, actually a little more, about $30,000, right? So that's about 3 times the gross annual income. But by 1998, 30 years later, the gross annual income increased to $45,000. It's good. But that same home or a comparable house cost about, guess? Yeah, $210,000. So I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's about 4.5 times, right? The gross annual income. But it gets better or worse depending on one's perspective, right? If you're making money off of these collateralized debt obligations, I guess it could be good. But for most Americans, by 2013, starting salary is about $60,000 at the CSU, right? The same home or comparable home now is, guess how much it is? Yeah, about $500,000 to $600,000, depending on where you're living, but about $600,000. Either way, it's about 8 to 10 times the gross annual income. So you can see the crisis here. And then you can look at this chart by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and you can see that most of the gain has been at the top 1% especially, right? And you can see it peak at one point. Here's another chart showing the family income change by quintile from 1979 to 2009. This is using $2009, I believe. Yeah, there it is. And again, you can see much of the gain disproportionately is at the top, whereas income for the bottom 20% has actually shrunk in real terms. We can also take the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient basically measures inequality within a given nation. And you can take that figure, and the higher the Gini coefficient, the greater the level of inequality. And you can compare the Gini coefficient of one country to another. And when you do that, you see that the United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients of OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Nations. And if you look at the G7 countries, right, the group of 7 countries, the United States has the highest Gini coefficient, meaning we have the highest level of income inequality. And that's not a surprise, right? If you look at this graph, you can see Gini coefficient going up since the late 60s, 67. And for the first time ever in our history, we have 2 CEOs, thanks to Kit providing me with this article, who have earned over $1 billion, right? Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and I forgot the other guy's name off the top of my head, but either way, $1 billion. On the other side, right, of this coin, if you will, because resources are limited, we have poverty. 1 in 7 Americans, or about 46 million Americans, are living in poverty today. That is, living below the federal poverty line. That's official, so I'll make that clear. If you were to place all these folks in one state, just picture this, the number exceeds the entire population of California. It's a lot of people. And we're not even counting those that are barely above the poverty line. And about 1 in 15, or over 20 million Americans, over 20 million, are living 50% below the poverty line. So that's deep poverty. And the most tragic aspect of poverty is that it disproportionately affects the health and well-being of kids like that little girl in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And there are millions of kids just like her all across America. I was reading a study recently that was arguing that about almost 1 in 4, but more than 1 in 5 children living in the United States are living in poverty. You can see right there, the U.S. is right up there or down there, depending how you look at it, with Romania when it comes to children living in poverty. So we have a serious crisis, and the level of wealth and income inequality, of course, has a devastating effect on the population. Poverty increases one's risk of several health-related problems, such as a shorter life expectancy. What could be worse, right? It also can have an impact, because of the high level of stress hormone that's associated with poverty, can have an impact on neural development. So these kids, for example, are at a disadvantage, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, from a young age, but it can also impact them biologically, right? Not just socially or politically. So epidemiologists Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, in their book, The Spirit Level, talk about some of the associations that exist between greater levels of inequality and wealth and social problems. So one thing that it's associated with is mental illness. And we shouldn't be surprised, because of the stress, right, and dissatisfaction that's brought on by absolute poverty or relative or even subjective deprivation living in a country like ours. And we're constantly bombarded with images of the good life. Part of it's to make us spend, like we talked about earlier, to deal with the crisis of overproduction. But it does cause us to be dissatisfied. And we're told that if you work hard enough, you can get there. But the reality is many people are blocked from this. And so it may cause us aspire to be rich or die trying, right? And think of that, all the different problems that arise from this situation. Another factor is that it impacts drug and alcohol abuse. So when we live in societies with greater levels of inequality, it's argued that there's greater levels of stress, of course, and a feeling of powerlessness and alienation. And we try to escape this alienation through drugs and alcohol. Homicide rates are also associated with greater levels of inequality. Again, looking at the OECD nations, the United States has the highest homicide rate, defined as assault deaths per 100,000 population. Of all the OECD nations, with the exception of Mexico, Estonia isn't listed there, but they have a lower homicide rate than us. I know these are pretty disturbing. Here's another one. When it comes to infant mortality rates, we don't rank up there. We're the most powerful country in the world, but our ranking when it comes to infant mortality rate is rather low. This chart doesn't show it, but we're slightly above Hungary, and we're tied with Poland when it comes to infant mortality rates. For time's sake, I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. Life expectancy is also impacted as well. So here, let me read this. According to the CIA World Factbook, in 2013, the U.S. ranks 51 out of 223 countries when it comes to life expectancy at birth. 51. Powerful nation, powerful economy, powerful military, right? But what's happening to our population? Obesity rates, a lot of things could be associated with, but Wilkinson and Pickett, or Pickett and Wilkinson, are arguing that greater levels of inequality associated with this as well. We know poverty is definitely associated with higher obesity rates. But you can see here, I mean, a third of Americans with, BMI of over 30 or 30 or over. So it's a serious concern. Something that all parents, right, are concerned about. We have the highest teenage pregnancy rate in the industrialized world. And again, if you have a chance to read The Spirit Level, it's a great read. So I'm going to go through this a little quicker, but it's associated with higher rates of teenage pregnancy. And something that a lot of people are aware of, especially living in California, prisons. Incarceration rates seem to be impacted by greater levels of inequality. So the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. You could read that. The U.S. makes up about 4 to 5%, about 4% of the world's population. But we make up about 25% of all those who are incarcerated. And our prison population is growing 20 times faster than our general population. And if you take all those that are incarcerated, we're talking about 2 million Americans who are incarcerated. Education also seems to be impacted by greater levels of inequality. We're the world leader, but not when it comes to science and math literacy, right, for 15-year-olds. I mean, I was reading a study, this is kind of old, but a significant percentage of American 12-year-olds couldn't even locate the United States on a global map. What percentage was that? I think it was 20%. And then check this out. Yeah, it's sad. The U.S. ranked 22nd out of 27 countries for high school graduation rates. So inequality has an impact there. And in One Nation Underprivileged, Why American Poverty Affects Us All, Mark Robert Rank also emphasizes the impact of poverty. I won't go into his findings, but he finds that it impacts many areas of our lives. And when it comes to health, I mean, we're talking about, just read a couple, heart disease, diabetes, malnutrition. So let's look at the impact of inequality on education. Now, it's not a surprise that social class and inequality dramatically impact education. To begin, schools reflect the inequalities, right, and inequities of society, which to a large extent is a consequence of the capitalist system, and we've talked a little bit about this. At the same time, schools also maintain and reproduce the social class structure. So although we're told that we're a meritocracy and that the best way to succeed is through getting a good education, one's access to a good education is greatly determined by what? Social class. Right on. Thanks, Jackie. Right on. Social class. Absolutely. Former student of mine. And unfortunately, this fact is often ignored by those who criticize our educational system, or they criticize educators. They're not accounting for this. And as far as funding goes, there's great disparities when it comes to funding, and it's made even worse because the well-to-do have the ability to raise large sums of money thanks to fundraisers and asking parents to just donate a few $100s here and there. The middle class, working class don't have that kind of option. And then check this out. To make matters worse, this is not the U.S. Census Bureau data, but the U.S. Census Bureau has found that we went from 5th in per pupil spending in 1965 to 35th in 2010. And then if you factor in, right, cost of living considerations, we're actually 49th of all states, including the District of Columbia, just ahead of Utah and Nevada. So right under that orange chart spending, you can see we're now 49th in the nation if you take into consideration cost of living, regional differences. And then I know we have a lot of counselors in the class too. Another challenge in the United States, especially California. We rank the worst when it comes to student to counselor ratios. In the academic year 2008 to 2009, now this is probably junior high and high school, but you're looking at a ratio of 814 students to every counselor. It's overwhelming. Here's the good news. I was going to say, man, you messed up my timing, brother. All right, here. We are. Well, I don't know if this is good news, but California is #1, right? In prison spending. Prison spending, guys. I love this picture, right? You have the prison and you have the school and you have these kids. Where's the hope? But California spends $8.8 billion a year on the prison industrial complex. And according to the Pew Research Center, this is, even controlling for inflation, a 216% increase over what California spent on prisons 20 years earlier. So it's dramatic. At the same time, crime has actually been going down, which is interesting. Don't have time to talk about that. But since the 1980s, we have built more prisons than colleges. Bad move on our part. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I don't know if anyone's read this great book, The Golden Gulag. It's an excellent book. Talks about, since 1984, California has completed 23 major new prison projects at $280 to $350 million apiece. But we only built 12 between 1852 to 1964. Just think about that. And the University of California system has added only 1 university since the 1980s. And so needless to say, the lack of spending on schools, the poor student-to-counselor ratios, it has a detrimental effect on our working class, working poor, and even lower middle class kids who often don't have a parent who attended a university to guide them in their academic endeavors. And so hopefully Proposition 30 will bring about some much needed changes, and hopefully we will bring about some much needed changes as well. Now going back to the notion that schools maintain and reproduce the class structure, let's quickly look at some of the different circumstances between middle class kids or higher, right? Upper middle class, upper class, versus those that are disadvantaged or poor. So quickly here, looking at the clock, middle class and higher. From the very beginning, and if you have never been poor, or it's hard to imagine, But from the very beginning, there's a major advantage. Not only your parents went to school, that's advantage right there, college that is. But the other advantage is that you have all these resources at your disposal, whether they're books or like these toys, right? Educational toys. I love giving them to my kids because we have privilege now, right? And so it's this Leapfrog, was it? I can't even remember the names, but they're educational toys. Or trips to the museum, which, we provide. The other advantage is that preschools, these private preschools, prepare the kids. They provide a solid foundation for kindergarten, and it seems to make a difference all the way through. And of course, they're one of the first things to get cut when, the government gets shut down or whatever. And so it's a serious problem. And these preschools often cost over $1,000 per month to send your kids. It's expensive. And then when they go to school, they attend well-funded schools with books. High school, where you could take the books home. I don't know what was going on with the high school, because the high school I attended had a mix of kids, from middle class, working poor. But for some reason, in a couple of my classes, we couldn't even take the books home, which I was happy to see, and we'd read the books together in the class. And often the kids would tear out pages to make it funny, or at least they'll say it was gone because they couldn't read or they didn't want to read. But these resources make a difference. And the access to tutoring is obvious. Preparation for college, the SAT, all of these things make a huge difference in the outcome. But here's another thing that a lot of people don't think about that helps to perpetuate inequality is the reality that schools reflect middle-class values. Cultural capital, right? I'll talk about that a little bit later. So middle-class parents are able to provide an advantage for their kids in various ways, and the kids are much more likely to get that degree, to land that middle-class job. Although, just for another talk maybe, these jobs are becoming less and less available because labor precarity, like many of our students are finding, is becoming the norm. A few others, social networks, access to jobs, right? That's another one. And for the wealthy, there's a major advantage, especially when it comes to the Ivy League schools. So George W. Bush might be a good example of this. His grandpa, Prescott, went to Yale. His daddy, H.W., went to Yale. And George W. went to Yale. And a lot of you are probably thinking he should have went to jail, but that's for another time. The other thing is that there's special admits. If you can donate a lot of money, hundreds of thousands, your kid's probably going to get in. And on top of that, you have influence of family members. So bottom line, there are advantages. Now let's look at the poor, or those who are economically disadvantaged. We know that education is affected by things outside of the educational system. The larger society must be considered. One's socioeconomic status greatly influences and impacts their life chances, something we teach in sociology and I'm sure in other areas. This is very disturbing, though, when you take into consideration a new study by the Southern Education Foundation that found 48% of school kids right now, public school kids, are low income. So 48% of the something like 50 million public school kids are low income. Now check this out. The bottom chart, 2011. Over half of the students in about 17 states are low income, meaning they qualify for, lunch programs. That's quite an increase from 2000, when there was only 4. Then let me just jump a little bit to social capital. Social capital is the wealth and income of the family. You've got, educational attainment, knowledge, and social networks. Of course, the poorer one is, the less of that we have, and so that places us at a disadvantage. The poor are also more likely to be, their homes are more likely to be destabilized by unemployment and poverty. And a lot of our students are also poor on this campus, so think about the lives, and some of us are poor, the lives that people are living, right? And so bouncing from home to home, and how hard it is to learn. And you top that, or you add to that, the impact of the war on drugs. Now, I know we've taken a different approach recently, but up till recently, we were incarcerating folks at an incredible rate. The urban minorities have been disproportionately arrested, convicted, and sentenced for drug crimes. Now, Michelle Alexander, in an excellent book titled The New Jim Crow, talks about this. And a lot of you nodded your head, you read this book. It's a great book. Although the majority of illegal drug users and dealers happen to be white, 3/4 of all people that are incarcerated for drug crimes are black or Latino, right? So talk about disproportionate. So when you're thinking about the minority kids in the so-called ghettos and the barrios all over the United States, their homes were, for the longest time, because of the war on drugs, being destabilized. How the heck can you learn when mom is taken out of the home because she has a drug problem, but a mom in the middle class community might be drinking vodka every night, but she's there for the kid, right? So it has a tremendous effect on learning. The lack of resources and cultural capital also obviously affects the ability of the students to learn and for the parents to prepare the kids. And poor health also obviously affects education. Quickly go through this. Food insecurity. 15% of American households are food insecure. It's pretty heavy. How can you learn when you're hungry? And on top of that, malnourishment and malnutrition can have an impact on neurodevelopment, which will have a devastating effect for the rest of the kid's life. And so we really have to think about, you don't have to think about that girl that I put up there, but the 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 kids that are poor that are being impacted by this type of tragic situation. The poorly funded schools, I think people understand. Some of us attended them. We've got dilapidated, overcrowded schools. But the other interesting thing is in some areas they are building up the schools. And I wish I had a picture of it. Some of these schools look more like prisons, which really begs the question, what are we preparing the kids for, right? Seriously, what are we preparing them for? Got to think about that. And then when they attend school, they're more likely to be taught by less qualified, less experienced, or substitute teachers because of the lack of permanent teachers in working class communities. And then Jonathan Kozel, I don't know if you've heard of him, he wrote many great books like The Shame of Nations, Savage Inequalities, and other scholars point out that the expectations are vastly different depending on the schools that you attend. So working class kids, if you have a chance to read Savage Inequalities, he actually interviews some of these kids, are trained to take on jobs in the secondary labor market, like the garment industry, fast food. And they argue that, well, we want to be realistic. So they're giving lip service to education being the great equalizer, but they're training them to take on low-paying jobs. The middle class, fortunately, they're taught to take on jobs like teaching and engineering and law, etc. And the wealthy are taught to become the leaders of the world. Louis Althusser says it best, I think. Schools are part of the state's ideological apparatus. So in this sense, it's basically teaching and training and socializing kids to conform to capitalist values and to accept their place in the social class structure, which is tied to hidden curriculum, which is teaching obedience to authority and conformity to cultural norms. It's good, because then you have people that will obey, not think, take orders like a good worker bee, and vote the way you tell them to vote, unfortunately, or not vote at all, because it's out of our hands, right? A few more. Financial obligations also is a major factor. I know you guys know this. When you talk to your students, sometimes they disappear. It's not because they don't care about school. It's because they've had to help their family members with their income. Often when I say this, I always remember one of my friends, Kenny, who was working poor, working class, single mother. And his mom and he moved out of Boyle Heights, bought a home in Pacoima, very happy, very proud, yeah, Pacoima. And his mom was killed, shot, right? I mean, but just thinking about, now he finished his degree actually, but just thinking about how hard it must have been to go through that and trying to achieve your goal. It's pretty heavy. And all of us know college is expensive. I don't care if you're middle class and working class. And in the past, if you're working poor, working class, there are more grants and scholarships available. Those are drying up. So when it comes to the cost of college, you got to equate that with the rising cost of tuition and the declining or stagnating, right? Stagnating or declining wages. So if you take a quick look here, from 2001 to right before the Great Recession, right, around 2008, it's hard to tell, tuition at the UCs and the CSUs, the Cal State universities, basically doubled. But from 2001 to after the Great Recession, it basically tripled at the UCs and quadrupled at the California State universities. It's wild, right? And then you add to that our community colleges, right? California community colleges. It's quadrupled as well. I started teaching at GCC in 2001. As Kendra pointed out, thanks Kendra. Now, I mean, look, it's gone up more than 4 times. I remember when I left high school, I think community college was free. I think it was, right? But by the time I started attending, they had that $5 per unit fee, which we thought was a lot of money. But then again, it's all relative. It's all relative. Now, you tie this to, again, that whole idea of debt and speculative bubbles and all that stuff that we talked about earlier. Student loans have grown over 500% since 1999. Nobody should be surprised about that. And then the outstanding student loan debt is now at $1 trillion. And all these factors have a synergistic effect, right, in creating members of our society to become basically the reserve army of workers. Unfortunately, we don't have the same need for some of the, we never had a need for all the reserve army of workers, but today it's even worse. And so what's going to happen, you know? So what does this have to do with education? Everything. It impacts education. But also I believe that education is the key to liberation. Now I know it might sound naive, but let me explain myself. As difficult as it is to hear about these problems, I've learned that whenever I talk about injustice or great levels of inequality and poverty, it really sparks the interest of students. I think that's what did it for me too. I mean, I don't think most people could imagine, but when I was younger, I was kind of angry, as my parents know, and got into a lot of, anyway, I was kind of angry. So I think when I learned about the injustices, I latched onto it, right? And it gave me a reason to read. It gave me a reason to go to school. It gave me a purpose. And in that way, I think it'll help our students too, to become lifelong learners like I mentioned earlier. When I started to think about a career in education, I thought, this is it. Education is the key to help people move up the social ladder, right? And I think a lot of us think about this. But the more I studied this phenomenon and the better I understood it, I came to realize that, yes, we can help some move up the social ladder, which is great. But the systemic nature of inequality will continue on and on. But despite this, I still feel very passionate about education and educating the population. Because as Antonio Gramsci pointed out, there is a struggle over beliefs and ideas, right? There is. That whole war that's going on, the cultural, ideological war. And so we got to teach our students to think, to develop a critical mind so that they can make informed choices and evolve into a higher level of consciousness. I know that sounds kind of heavy. There he is. But to motivate the students, we have to recognize the value of each student. We got to recognize the value of their experiences. And we have to provide them with a sense of purpose. It may not be revolution. Shouldn't have to be. But it should be. Why not? Thank you for that. Thanks. But there needs to be a sense of purpose. And so Paulo Freire, there he is on this side, and Antonio Gramsci emphasized mutually respectful dialogue as being critical for learning. So again, we have to step back and reflect on what is our position in relation to our students. What is the dialogue? Is it mutually respectful between the students to us or from us to the students? And we also have to instill in them not only the purpose, but a desire to make a difference in the world. And it has nothing to do with indoctrinating them into a particular ideology. Some people might think that's what I'm doing in my classes. I hear things. I'm not. I promise you I'm not. It's not about that. It's about, some people wish I would maybe, but no, it's about teaching them to think, right? To understand the world as it actually is. Let them come to that themselves. And this was the essence of Paulo Freire's concept of critical consciousness, right? Critical consciousness was this ability to perceive and understand social, political, and economic oppression and to take action against those oppressive conditions, right, that we live under. And all of this, I know this people might not want to see what's coming up next, but all of this is somehow related to the college's core competencies or institutional learning outcomes. Now I'll explain why. I had to do that. No, well, good educators, and I know we're good educators, have always, right, intuitively done institutional learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, and student learning outcomes, because that's what we did. And without anyone telling us, and I want to repeat, without anyone telling us, we're constantly assessing our students and improving our teaching methods based upon careful reflection of the data that we've been always collecting, sometimes more formally, often more informally. So let's take a quick look at how this could be liberating. Now, I'm not saying the ILOs are liberating. I'm talking about education, but how we cover the ILOs through education. So communications through small group and large group discussions. I know a lot of us do this, as well as writing assignments. We're teaching the students to be effective communicators, right? To articulate their ideas, to argue their positions effectively. And this is enhanced, obviously, when the topics relate directly to the students' lives. And a lot of our students are coming in now. Not everyone has the same subject as me. Sociology is great. You can cover a lot of different topics. But I understand that many of my students are working class, working poor. And so if it resonates with them, they're going to provide a product, a paper, whatever it might be, that's much more worthwhile. Mathematical competency, quantitative reasoning. A lot of our students are scared of math, as a lot of mathematicians in the class or math professors know. We don't cover much math in sociology, though we could, right? I've taught statistics in the past. I don't know if I'm very rusty now. But in my class, though, we provide some basic understandings of statistics so that they can examine inequality by using these tools. So we cover that. Information competency, by providing assignments like library research. We teach the students to use peer-reviewed journals, and we help them examine, right, the difference between the right type of information, the appropriateness, the quality, I think that's the language, of the information that exists. Not that good with the language that's being used for SLOs and ILOs, so excuse me, it's not there. Critical thinking, probably one of the most important. Students develop an understanding of and discuss the contradictions that exist within our economic, political, and social system. Also, by applying different theoretical approaches in our classes, that also enhances their ability to think. And this is all done all the time for decades and probably, centuries. Global awareness and appreciation. See the geographer in the back, right? Students study inequality across the world, and they develop an understanding and appreciation for the interconnections that exist between nations and people. They also examine how global economic systems and policies, right, that's really important, like NAFTA or Free Trade Agreement or Area of Americas or the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership more recently, how they can either increase or decrease, right, global inequality. Learning outcome. Personal responsibility. Through critical consciousness, students come to see themselves, and this is really important, as subjects in the world, as opposed to objects, because most of their lives they've been alienated. They don't see themselves as subjects. So by developing critical consciousness, they become empowered to not only examine the world, right, in its real terms, the real conditions that they're living under, but if there is inequality and injustice, and not everyone agrees that inequality is injustice, and we won't go there today, but when there is injustice, to do something about it, right? That's what we say. We want to teach our kids and students to become good citizens. What does that even mean, right? To be involved. Application of knowledge. Is that coming up? There it is. Students discover, and this is very sociological, that not only are they shaped by the society in which they live, they learn that they can play a role in shaping society by applying the information that they gain through, again, serious study, emphasizing that. Can't just have opinions, and we got to shoot them down for that, but through serious study, serious analysis. And all of this, right, allows the educators to work with our students in truly transformative ways. And I wanted to, got just a few minutes, but end with a quote. This is Richard Shaw's preface to Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, banned in Arizona. Quote, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. So it is my sincere hope that we as educators empower our students to think as opposed to believe. By doing this, we can ensure that our society will continue to evolve into a higher state of being and bring about the social transformation that's necessary to look out for future generations. Kodomo no tameni, right? So I'm going to end with that. I know we don't have much time left. And thank you so much for your attention. And I hope you guys join me for lunch. Thanks.